In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Welcome back to Orthodox Survival Course. We're starting again after a hiatus of a few months. This is class 32. It's also our introduction to part 2 of our course. Part 1 of our course was to bring us from the beginning of the Church up through the 19th century to the dawn of the 20th century. And now we're going to do, which is probably the more difficult part of the course, which is dealing with more recent events, with our own time. So part 2 is understanding the 20th century and dealing with the 21st century, because this, to earn our name of survival course, we have to give practical knowledge, not just a theoretical or academic understanding, but a practical wisdom and practical inspiration and suggestions to people how to live today, to face what we're dealing with, but live today in light of our Orthodox faith, by the power of our faith. So after a break of a few months, we shall now, with God's help, begin part 2 of our course, which I have been putting off for some time. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've been putting it off. We did have a nice short course when we talked about prayer and Holy Communion, and we needed that because, of course, my vocation as a priest is not just to talk about history or great philosophical concepts, but also, of course, to talk directly about spiritual life. But also, I was putting off doing part 2 because I knew it would be more difficult than part 1. It is always easy to look back. They say hindsight's 20/20, right? Look back and say, aha, that's the way it was. This is what happened, that's what happened, this is what it means, and so forth. But it is much harder to deal with more recent events and with current events, both intellectually, because you are too close to see the whole picture, see, and emotionally, because you have a real stake in what you and those around you believe is going on right now. You have a stake in this. This affects my children, my grandchildren. This affects my life. See, so intellectually, we don't have as much perspective on the 20th century as we have on the 15th or the 12th century, right? Because it's so recent. And for people my age, I'm in my 60s, my age and older, the 20th century is very, very alive. It's very real. That's our century. That's what we think of as being now. The 21st century is like after now, almost. But the 20th century is very real to us. And so it's hard for us to have perspective, both intellectually and emotionally. But we have to grapple with it, because the Lord directs us to read the signs of the times and to interpret our current life in light of the gospel, in light of the teaching of the church. So I have to give a warning ahead of time that some things I may say in the second half of the course will be uncomfortable. It's always more uncomfortable to talk about what really affects you. And there may be more possibility of disagreeing among those who hear these talks from here on out. But this is unavoidable if we are going to grow in understanding. Without a little tension, without a little friction, there's no growth. Right? So we have to be willing to hear things perhaps we've thought were wrong, or we didn't know about, or a way of understanding things that seems uncomfortable or against the current of the times. Okay. As our most recent class, class 31, we had brought our study of the development of Western European thought and its effects on civilization, including our Orthodox civilization, up to the end of the 19th century, with the open proclamation of the philosophy of nihilism. Remember, we spent several classes toward the end of our part 1 on Father Seraphim Rose's book on nihilism. And really, once you realize what it's all about, going into the 20th century, is nihilism, that is, nothingism, right? Right there you have your prism through which to view all the so-called great events that people make so much of in the 20th century. They were not really great. Well, they were big, but they were not great in the sense of something lofty or noble or even interesting, but simply stupid and evil and destructive. Right? The great movements of the 20th century are stupid, right? Besides being evil and destructive. It was not only the most evil century so far since the coming of Christ into the world, but also the most inane and meaningless. Okay? All the great movements and so forth were not great at all. They partook of demonic emptiness, okay? Which is what inane means. Our English word inane is from a Latin inanus, which means empty. But then remember, the rationale behind it all is nihilism, or nothingism. Okay? So the thought and spirit behind every progressive step of the 20th century is purely parasitical and destructive. Because the demonic spirit can't create, it can only destroy. So the so-called great advances or improvements or new programs are just mutilations and destructions of what was true and good, of the positive and creative capital that had been created by 19 centuries of Christian civilization. And they just chopped it up and mutilated it and put it back together in monstrous forms and said they were making progress.
Now there's not much to destroy.
Now, at this point, there's not much left to destroy. That's right. But in the 20th century, there was a great deal to destroy. There was a great deal left to destroy. See, and they did. So it was a consumption. It was like a great, beautiful forest of redwoods or sequoias, and in a few hours, a fire wipes it out. Well, this is the 20th century. It's a cataclysm in which the accumulated glory and riches and beauty of the Christian world were just wiped out in a vast catastrophe.
Millions and millions murdered.
And millions, hundreds of millions, perhaps, we don't know. It's the first time in history that tens of millions of people were killed by what was supposedly their own government. Supposedly their own government. Which leads us to believe, and we'll get this later on, that it wasn't really their own government, but it were governments that had been hollowed out from the inside and occupied by a foreign element. But it seemed like, well, the Russian government's killing all these Russians, or the Chinese government's killing all these Chinese, and so forth and so on. So it's a completely negative program. The whole 20th century progress, so-called, ideologies, movements, so forth, were a completely negative program. They really couldn't create. They can only destroy. There are bright spots in the 20th century, of course. The heroic rearguard action of saints and heroes struggling for their faith, for the church, the preservation of the historic Christian nations with their received cultures. But these isolated heroes were all much hated. They were much slandered, who were going against the mainstream, going against the grain, and they always lost. Ultimately, they were either voted out or assassinated or marginalized or anathematized or whatever it took to get them out of the way, whether literally out of the way by killing them or just socially or politically or religiously out of the way.
Now they assassinate their memories.
Now the damnatio memoriae. Now they assassinate their memories. So you really can't believe anything you read about any major figure of the 20th century in so-called mainstream academic or journalistic literature, or certainly not in the media, not in movies and garbage like that. So though their efforts, the efforts of these heroes, these saints and heroes, did preserve what we have left today, because if they hadn't preserved it, we wouldn't have anything left, right? Their efforts preserve what we have left today, what is passed on to us, and for this we owe them a debt of gratitude that is incalculable. And to keep their memories and part of that debt is to restore their memories and to tell the truth, right? Tell the truth. Because they told the truth. They suffered for telling the truth. Okay? These heroes were not outwardly successful, but in worldly terms, they were the losers in the 20th century, right? They were not successful on the grand scale, on the big stage of worldliness, right? So on the grand scale, evil was in the 20th century and remains in the 21st century outwardly triumphant, on center stage, so to speak. And the good is marginalized to the corners and the byways, the dens and caves of the earth, to use that poignant image that St. Paul uses in Hebrew 11 when he's talking about the saints of the Old Testament. As I say this, however, it is not in a spirit of gloom, and certainly not hopelessness. Remember, hopelessness is a sin. Okay? Despair is a sin. Right? We are the children of the church. Therefore, we belong to God, who is already the victor in the great contest of history. God has already won. The question is not whether God is going to win. The question is who's going to be on his side. Who's going to remain on his side. We must not only accept, but what is more, be grateful for the part God has assigned us in history. See, it's a great trap to say, "Oh, pity me, poor me. Why do I live now? Why do I live in some other period where it was easier to be a Christian, or more people believe the way I believe, or there are more people like me?" Because that's not being grateful to God. God put us here for a reason, in this time, in this place. We must be determined to believe that from all eternity, the all-good God, by his sovereign will and in his infinite wisdom, has assigned us to live precisely at this time for our salvation. This certainty gives us great joy and courage, and it inspires us to heroism. Today, to be an Orthodox Christian, truly, really, you have to desire and be willing to strive for heroic virtue. We can't be lukewarm. We have to strive for heroic virtue. It is in the spirit of Christian hope, therefore, the invincible hope in the risen Lord, and by way of a call to Orthodox heroism, to courageous and prophetic confession, and if need be, martyrdom, that I offer Part 2 of our course. Part 2 proposes to construct an Orthodox filter through which to view the 20th century. Remember, our whole project has been constructing this Orthodox filter, this way of an Orthodox set of assumptions and a framework to view history. So we need to do this for the 20th century. As much as possible, our current situation in the young 21st century, though that's the most difficult because the time you're living in is the most difficult to understand. I think that since we began our course last year, most everyone has realized that this study we're doing is serious business. If some have not realized it yet, they will now. Okay. So this is not an idle academic exercise, but a striving to understand our situation. Okay. The Christian world prior to August 1914. Despite all the bad developments that we described for so many classes in Part 1, beginning with the High Middle Ages and culminating in the onset of the Age of Revolution with the French Revolution and its aftermath, Christian civilization, so-called, whether Orthodox or Catholic or Protestant, still seemed outwardly like the dominant force in the world, right up to World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution. So inwardly, what we were tracing in our course was the inward decay of the Western European Christianity, spirit, philosophy, thought. But outwardly, the Western European nations were flourishing, right? They were becoming that tiny part of the world. If you look at Europe, if you just exclude European Russia and just look at Europe, apart from European Russia, it's this tiny little place. And yet these people had become, in many ways, the masters of the world. They were flourishing. And to some extent, our Orthodox nations, either Russia in its long ascent to power going back to the 15th century, or even the newly born Orthodox nations in the 19th century, took part in this success, took part in this triumph, so to speak, of the 19th century. Okay. So outwardly, the Christians, or European culture in general, seemed dominant right up to World War I, the dominant force in the world. Recall that with Tsar Alexander I's defeat of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna, 1814-1815, the forces of so-called reaction, the conservative monarchical element of European leadership, put the brakes on the progress of revolution. So the French Revolution was the first outbreak, and they kind of put a lid on it, okay, in the events that accompanied the fall of Napoleon. And though the 19th century seethed with revolutionary movements, behind the scenes, but also breaking out into public sporadically, like the revolutions of 1848 and the assassinations of important people like Tsar Alexander II. And there was a lot of bad art and bad philosophy and so forth. In general, there was peace and prosperity under a nominally Christian banner. One of the best ways of understanding this is to look at the effect of the British Empire and the Anglican Church on Africa and Asia, not to mention the Anglophone countries of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, and so forth. So the British, of course, reached the apogee of their power by the year 1900. And accompanying the spread of British power was outwardly the spread of Christianity, their brand of Christianity, which is the Anglican Church. And wherever the British went, yes, they were doing economic exploitation and they were doing all these other things like destroying China with the opium trade. But they were also planting their Anglican churches, building hospitals, schools, orphanages, a tremendous network of institutions throughout the world, and also bringing the English language throughout the world, which is why today English is the international language. The British and then their successor empire, the American Empire, have made English this dominant language. And the 19th century Victorian English, many of them were sincerely religious, but the most zealous ones for bringing the light of Anglicanism to the brown and yellow people and so forth were progressives. They were evangelicals in their theology, but they were progressives in their social thought. So there's a term, and it's a funny term. I've mentioned it before. From our point of view, it's comic. But they invented this term called muscular Christianity, that they had a muscular Christianity that was using worldly power, the power of the steamship, right? The power of the railroad, the power of the telegraph, to bring their version of the gospel to the world, which was mainly a vision of secular progress and material advance under the banner of the Anglican Church and the English crown. So it ended up being, even though many of the preachers and the theologians and the missionaries, many of whom were women, many of whom enormously self-sacrificial people, whole families that would just move to Africa or move to Asia and live in terrible circumstances to carry out their missions. Even though their zeal was very admirable and they felt themselves to be sincerely religious, their vision from our Orthodox point of view, and really from any patristic or scriptural point of view, was humanistic. The idea of progress, the idea of creating heaven on earth, the idea of the advance of society, the idea that mankind is always progressing, right? That everything's getting better and better every day in every way. This optimistic view of the condition of the world, if improved by technology side by side with the spread of evangelical Christianity. So this is the kind of Christianity that the British were spreading, through their vast commercial, political, and military empire. And I pick out the British because they were the most dominant force in the globe in the 19th century. But they are just you might say, a pure distilled version of the Western European project in general, which is one of increasing all the time, more and more increasingly humanistic, materialistic, and a secular view of the Christian church and of the mission of the Christian church. And so, of course, even though it's impressive on the outside, it's hollow on the inside. Of course, the Roman Catholic Church had its own version of this, which is the great power, the outward pomp, beauty, organization, effectiveness, and reach of the Roman Catholic organization. It's also very impressive. But as we saw later, we're going to see later in the 20th century, it was all hollow on the inside. So when the forces of subversion got into the Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century, it was very easy to hollow out the corrupt insides of it. And then when the Vatican II and the popes since Vatican II pushed the button, the whole thing fell. It was like a magnificent building that had been wired for destruction. And when it was time, all they had to do was push the button and it fell. In 10 years, between 20 years, 1955 to 1975, they easily wiped out the accumulated capital of 2,000 years. It was extremely easy. When it happened, it happened almost in a blink of an eye.
There was not much left anyway.
There was nothing left. Nothing left on the inside. It was all on the outside.
No, I mean, whatever they destroyed was not much.
It was not much, but they destroyed it, yes.
It was already dead.
Oh, it's already dead, but it was still a huge
facade.
But then it collapsed so rapidly, right? So, so by the end of the 19th century, it seemed that Christian nations and Christian institutions were the dominant force in the world. And yet, if we'd gone back in time and taken Father Stephen's Orthodox Survival course to 1899, we could have explained to them that bad things were about to happen. Right? Actually, I'm being facetious, of course. A lot of the people knew bad things were about to happen. Dostoevsky's novels, for example, are prophetic warnings about what's about to happen. And both Orthodox and also there were Roman Catholic writers who were
He
warning.
was not prophetic, he was part of it at one point. So,
Well, he knew what was going to happen.
because he was there.
Right, he had been part of it. Right, he had been part of socialist and anarchist organizations before he
So he knew the plan.
had his conversion. Yeah, he knew the plan. Yeah. Okay. A mainstream historian, Barbara Tuchman, paints a vivid picture of the outward peace and confidence of Christian Europe at the end of the 19th century in the introduction to her famous work on the beginning of World War I, The Guns of August. It's a very well-known work, mainstream work. And I'm only mentioning it not to promoting it as an understanding of the reasons for World War I, but just to mention the preface or the introduction to the book in which she describes the funeral of King Edward VII of England in 1910. And she describes the funeral of Edward VII is a tableau or a picture, a living picture of the power and the pomp and the pageantry and the seeming permanence of the European monarchies of Christendom, so to speak. And she describes all the crowned heads who were there and who they were and the magnificent ceremony and so forth and so on. It was like the sunset of old Europe. So it's very instructive, actually, to read that.
They had the same thing in Russia in 1910, 1912, same.
1913, there was the tricentenary of the Romanov dynasty.
So they had the same.
Magnificent triumph, right? And then Tuchman wrote an entire book called The Proud Tower, which describes Europe at the end of the 19th century and leading up to World War I. But from our Orthodox point of view, we understand that all this was precisely a proud tower. That's where she got the title of her book, The Proud Tower. It was the Proud Tower, a repeat of the Tower of Babel scheme, right? So-called Christian civilization by that time was dominated by heretical Christianity. Both official heretical Christianity, the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics, and to some extent the Lutherans and so forth. But even heretical Christianity then acting within Orthodoxy and trying to corrupt Orthodoxy, right? And above all, is characterized by the spirit of worldliness. Once there's a spirit of worldliness, even if the church is officially Orthodox, the worldliness eats away at the people's will to live in an Orthodox way, and finally, at some point, the mind starts to go too. See? Most critically, the Orthodox nations, who should have been the preservers of the true faith, were by this time infected by the worldly spirit, whose growth we have traced in part 1 of our course. So remember, in our course for the first 1,000 years, we talked about Orthodoxy, the one united Orthodox Church, right, of East and West. And then with the Middle Ages, we kind of put the Orthodox countries aside and we started focusing on the High Middle Ages in the West, the Renaissance, Reformation, to trace what happened in the West. But then the West comes back into contact with the Orthodox and starts affecting the thinking and the culture of the Orthodox people. And though, of course, outside forces conspired against them, it was because their immune system of pure Orthodoxy had been compromised. They could not fight the infection. See, Orthodox is our immune system, but if your immune system is compromised, you can't fight the infection. So even though, yes, there were outside forces, it wasn't the idea of some actual Russians or Romanians or Greeks to destroy their own country. Those people came from the outside and did things to us, but we did not resist, and certain people in strata of our society cooperated because their immune system of their orthodoxy and their pure Orthodox worldview, their zeal for Orthodoxy, and their zeal for the true historic mission of their own nation and so forth had been compromised. So they collaborated. Right? The genuine otherworldly spirit of true Orthodoxy was preserved in isolated places and isolated movements, where the faithful would gather around holy monasteries or outstanding pastoral figures. Okay? But the overall trajectory of the ruling classes was not good. Okay? They were all infiltrated by Freemasonry. You could look at almost every single country. But the ruling classes became infiltrated by Freemasonry. Okay? And in general, had become complicit in the revolutionary plan of destruction to a greater or lesser degree. Now, they weren't all They weren't all conscious agents or revolutionaries. Okay? Some were actual Freemasons and conspirators cooperating with the cosmopolitan element to bring in the destruction. Okay. Ultimately, of course, it's just the devil, right? But the majority were not. The majority were not conscious revolutionaries. Most of them were useful idiots. Okay? They were either liberals who were scornful of the church, or some of them were political conservatives. They were for the church, but they viewed orthodoxy from a secular viewpoint. And many holy figures in the 20th century explained, for example, I'll just give one example that I'm familiar with, because of course I keep recurring to Russian history because that's my background, that's what I'm more familiar with. The failure of the White Army in the Civil War, 1920 to 1922, was because they were not pure Orthodox. The White Army were not pure Orthodox. They were not pure monarchists. Many of them were liberals. Many of them were Freemasons. They were anti-communist. They didn't like the Bolsheviks, but their orthodoxy wasn't pure. Their worldview wasn't pure. Their hearts weren't totally with God. You see, and a lot of them were liberals, and so they didn't have the spiritual power, the strength, and God basically abandoned them. See, to their fate. And this is what happens when you're not pure with the Lord, right? So there are conservatives, but who view orthodoxy from a secular viewpoint as an element of national identity. Well, we need the church. We need a strong church to have a good nation. Well, we're glad they feel that way, but that's not enough. You have to be Orthodox through and through. Okay? They just see orthodoxy as their part of their national identity, but not the one truth for all mankind, not the true faith. Okay? So in the summer of 1914, we have an openly prosperous, openly triumphant Christian Europe, which is actually standing on a cliff. They're ready to jump to their destruction. Okay. Another way of looking at this is that the 20th century is civilizational suicide. Okay. Civilizational suicide and living after the end of the world. The two world wars and the accompanying revolutions that destroyed the historic Christian states were actually one long action of suicide. It was a vast civilizational suicide, conducted in several stages by the entire civilization of historically Christian Europe. The world turned upside down. It was destroyed. Right? I often tell people that to understand our situation, we have to realize we are living after the end of the world. Okay? After the end of our world. Okay? And what is our world? Our world, outwardly speaking, right, is the entire civilization that arose after St. Constantine and the peace of the church that we've described in the first part of our course, right? That endured for 1,600 years, the Constantinian era, where the throne and the altar were united, and there was Christian nation states and Christian empires. This, quote-unquote, suddenly collapsed between 1914 and 1945, or so it seemed. It seemed sudden. Okay? Especially when people were caught in it, and it was so overwhelming. And everything was being destroyed around them, and so many people they knew were being killed, and their whole lives were destroyed. In part one of our course, we learned that this was not sudden at all. The magnificent edifice, the facade, had become hollow on the inside. It was just waiting to get knocked over. Okay. In part two, we propose to examine how the knocking over happened and what this means for us today. Okay. So we want to keep on with our project of constructing our orthodox set of lenses to view history, and now we need a lens through which to view these recent events that have created the world we currently live in. This is the goal of part two of our course. And these really are very recent events. The problem is that today, young people today think of 20 years ago as ancient history. But really, 1914, we just finished the commemoration of the 100 years of World War I. This past November was the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. And last July was the 100th anniversary of the murder of the Russian imperial family. And many of us, I was a priest in the Russian church in the 80s and 90s. We knew people who remembered the revolution. They were children or young people at the time of the revolution. I knew people who had seen the Tsar. Okay. If you're in the Balkan countries, like in Romania, this is much more immediate. There's your parents and grandparents who were killed by the communists, not your great-grandparents. It was your own parents, right, who were killed, imprisoned, so forth and so on. You remember, since it happened a generation later in the Balkans, there are many, many more of us who remember, intimately acquainted with people who lived before the destruction of the Christian state. So we have to realize this is very recent. See, our enemies want us to think this is long ago and far away. That's all over with. They want us to think, oh, that's all over with. That was a fairy tale. That was a long time ago. No, it was not a long time ago. It was a very short time ago.
You say it was a long time ago and never happened.
It never happened. Yes, it never really was like that.
It's a book.
That's the name of a book? A long time ago and it never happened? Well, we know it happened. And so we're not going to be fooled. And it's very important, actually, to have good library. There are many important books that have been shelved, abandoned, where the author's character was assassinated, the author was literally assassinated, that give the true story of what happened in the past 100, 200 years. And some of us, we have friends who have really good libraries, and we've kept these books. And they're all on the internet. And the interesting thing is that our friend, quote-unquote, Google, or actually, paradoxically, Google, has preserved many of these books.
Most of it.
You can find the truth on Google of all places. They're simultaneously deplatforming people who fight them. They preserved all these books by the providence of God. So we need to realize that we can't just be content with so-called mainstream or approved sources of history because they're written by bad guys. Okay. So one way of thinking about our situation is this. This is my third theme tonight, an image of our situation. What's our situation? Think of a castle. Think of our living in a castle besieged by enemies. And the castle consists of concentric ring walls with the innermost keep in the center. Okay. The outermost ring wall consists of the Christian nations, which were destroyed by the forces of revolution. The next ring wall consists of the historic church institutions. Now they're almost completely destroyed by ecumenism, modernism, and so forth. Next is the ring of the family, which is now being destroyed by what could, for lack of a better term, be called cultural Marxism. You can call it feminism, you can call it LGBT agenda, you can call it all kinds of things, but it's a convenient term to be cultural Marxism. Also being destroyed by anti-Christian economics and anti-Christian political arrangements. After the family, what we have left is the innermost keep of our own organism, right? With the body being destroyed by drugs, toxic food, water, ambient radiation, chemtrails, whatever, you name it. Okay? And finally, the mind and the soul being destroyed by the mental fragmentation of electronic addiction. First, just plain old regular propaganda, going back to the newspapers and radio and TV, but now it's on steroids, right, with electronic addiction and so forth. So after this last destruction is accomplished, what will be left? Of course, there will be people left. We know that God's promise. We're not all going to be destroyed, but we have to make an active effort not to be destroyed, right? So our plan for part 2 will be to go through the destruction of each of these concentric rings and try to understand it from the Orthodox point of view. At each stage of our study, we need to not only provide understanding, which is the most basic survival tool, first understanding, but then we have to offer suggestions to action. Well, this being so, how therefore should we live? If this is the case, then how should I respond? Okay? May our all-provident Lord, our invincible victor, be our hope in our efforts. Amen.